Chapter 8. Mount Lanayru. The space in which the goddess spoke to her was a place of perfect clarity, not darkness, but nothingness, the cradle in which knowledge might rock, waiting to pull itself out into the world. That was how she had come to think of it, a birthplace, a kiln in which the act of knowing became an act of creation. It was empty and clean and safe. But now the emptiness was stricken with a sickness, an oily film that clung to the very fabric of creation, every atom of her being and every mote of consciousness twisted up with the corruption. The malice, she thought, knowing the word though she did not remember it. It's here. It's everywhere. But the sickness ate at her, weighing on her thoughts, pushing down the golden light that was calling her name. She held on to consciousness within consciousness as fiercely as she'd ever fought for anything in her life. Until this moment she didn't know what willpower was because she had never had to test it like this. But the malice clung to her, crushed her. Am I dying? She wondered, and she was. Kaya stopped, bending forward at the waist, adjusted Zelda's weight on her back, breathed in, breathed out, straightened herself and continued walking, shifting her grip on Zelda's arms so that she did not place too much pressure on any one place for too long. She didn't want to cause nerve damage, didn't want to cut off blood flow, didn't want Zelda to die on her back, and she began to hum to herself because entertaining those thoughts would kill her, kill them both. She had to keep the thoughts out, and so she hummed, a nonsense tune without real rhythm, just noise. When the fireball had descended she had looked up at it and thought that the moon had caught fire and was falling toward them. A strange thought, why hadn't she thought of the falling stars that occasionally fell all over Hyrule? But it had been the moon she had thought of, terrible and pure and burning and full of hate. It had fallen toward them, too, just as Zelda was telling her that she had remembered something. She had reacted out of panic at seeing it, had thrown her body at Zelda's, seeking to shield her from oblivion or join her in it. There had been a tone, a ringing bell like the one that had rung when Zelda had destroyed the Lionel, but softer, gentler, the quietest thing in the world, a subtle flexing of power that seemed altogether too little. A flash of golden light as she had looked at Zelda's face, and then the world had been lost in noise and violence and light and pain. She did not remember the pain, just that it had been painful. That was probably a mercy, and as she walked she wondered if it was thanks to Zelda or thanks to the defenses of her own body, its willingness to forget things which, if remembered, would prevent its function. She remembered a sound that should have crushed her, reduced her bones to powder, but it had been muffled as if on the other side of a very thick wall. That was everything she could recall. She had regained sense of herself in this center of a blasted wasteland, and it wasn't until she looked toward Mount Lanayru that she had realized they had not moved at all. That thought, in and of itself, would have been enough to send her into a panic, but she fought it down. That didn't matter. The fact that they were standing in the center of a crater rimmed with fire the color of nightshade and moonless nights, that they should have both been dead and less than dead with their ashes scattered so far that they could never be recovered, that the enormous hand of an angry god could have smitten the firmament and effected no change more severe than this, none of that mattered. She was alive. She could move. Zelda was at her feet, unconscious. I must get her out of here, she thought, and so she had. Her hands had been steady as she lifted Zelda into a standing position, and when one of them dared to shake as she was locking Zelda's knees she bit hard into the flesh at the base of her thumb, clamping down until she thought she would draw blood, but the shaking stopped first. Carefully, Kaya draped the princess's arms around her own neck, lifting her like a backpack, and began to walk. The going, in some ways, was not hard. Kaya was strong, and Zelda was not very heavy. In other ways, though, when she looked up into the sky and saw the raging storm of wind and lightning and darkness that ate at the very air around it, heard the howling of a maelstrom that should have killed them as it was born and should have killed them again, now, in its infancy, she felt a weakness in her legs. Please, Your Grace, she said, caught herself. Please, Zelda, forgive me for my failures, and hold on for a little while. I will see you to safety. She could not imagine what safety looked like. She could not imagine what safety would be compared to whatever power had just tried to destroy them. The mountain was holy. On some level she knew that did not matter, but on another she knew that she could not go back down the road, where monsters had just been reborn from the bleeding earth. So, she walked toward the mountain, toward a symbol of grace that she hoped would serve the woman she carried. The whole of reality was the corruption. She could feel it flowing into her and out of her like air, like water. It was the background of everything. It was not even painful, did not have the courtesy to cause her pain. What it made her feel was some child of both nausea and weakness, a thought including draining of her strength and her sense of self. She did not have her memory, that had slipped away from her already, and the part that she did recall was being eaten away by the malice. I loved him, she thought. She did not feel it now, did not have the perspective necessary to feel it, did not know if she would feel it even with all of her memory returned to her, but that knowledge was precious to her. That was who she had been, what had mattered to her in the distant past, and the person she had once been had fought terribly to possess that knowledge. The malice slipped into her mind like a hand, tried to grab hold of that thought, and she grasped onto it with the fervor of a dying woman. It was warm, warmer than fire, warmer than a mother's embrace. Once, long ago, I loved someone. It was a source of strength to me. You fell. The voice of the malice was everywhere, everything, shaking the entire world, and she could feel the reverberations of its power inside of her. It was a storm, and she was but a person buffeted by a power greater than herself. It hurt now, it hurt tremendously. The pain was a lance to her reverie, slicing open her fear and her weakness. If I am in pain, then it is trying to hurt me. I don't know how I know that to be true, but it is. You failed. In the great darkness of that place she opened her eyes, taking in everything. The goddess was not here, it was her and the malice in an infinite space. The interior of the soul? She could not say. But whatever this was, it was a place that was supposed to be hers, and the thing attacking her was trying to take it away. More, who was trying to take away everything. No, she thought. Then, because thought was not enough, she found her voice in that place, and spoke. No. Whatever you are, I'm investing too much agency to think you are trying to do anything. Whatever did this, the calamity, possesses some degree of intelligence. But you do not. You failed. The words reverberated in everything, and she had to press her hands against her ears because they were so loud. She was no longer growing weaker, though her strength was not returning. She wondered if that would be reflected in her physical body, had the muscle there been sapped away. Would threads of corruption be wending across her skin? Would Paya see them? Paya. No. Don't panic. Don't think about her yet. Don't think about anything but the problem at hand. There was not consciousness, but a central node through which the malice operated. She could feel it out there, a seed from which roots spread, infecting her and her thoughts. Some minor part of the greater whole. I don't understand what this is, but I am surer than ever that it is not the calamity. Still, the calamity sent it, which means that it is supposed to have been enough to kill me. Or not? Is death this thing's aim? She looked at herself, at the darkness that was trying to eat away at every cell of her, and clenched her hands into fists. I have power. Granted by Hylia, perhaps. Would that matter to something like the calamity? Could it be that it fears it? Covets it? A flinch in the darkness, a word achieving resonance with a mind that was not a mind, and she felt some part of her determination flowing back, even over the thunderous, you failed, that shook creation. This was not meant to kill me. Or if it was, then it was meant to neutralize my power in case of my survival. She looked out into the dark, into the place where the heart of the malice be, and shouted, What do you fear of me, creature? What is it your master would not have me do? No words in answer, now. Just an incoherent bellowing and a surge in the power of the dark, a surge that ate away at the fabric of everything, ate away at her, and she screamed in pain and then in fury. That this thing would kill this place, attempt to kill her, was an affront that she could not have imagined hours ago. She took that agony, that fury, and plunged herself into it. She was Zelda. She was the princess who had failed. She had loved, long ago. She would see the world free of the burden that weighted down. She would walk free across verdant fields. The pain was cleansing. Her fury inflamed her thoughts, lent clarity to her vision. The malice bellowed, and she turned on it, took its matter, reached deep within herself to that place that had been closed to her until love had broken the lock. Deep, deep she reached, down into her ancestral being that ran back into time immemorial, and she did not know how she knew this of herself, but she did, and when she called on her strength it was the strength of generations past counting. The malice bellowed, but she did not raise her voice in turn. She let go of her fury in its place. She found her purpose. She wrenched it free from within herself. There was a golden light. The fire at the edge of the crater parted for them as she drew near to it, and Pia stepped off the blasted land and onto grass that was kissed by snow. She looked back and saw the flames leap into life again, and wondered at how much of Zelda's power was still working even as she slept. She protects me even now, Pia thought, and she was ashamed and grateful in equal parts, did not know how to reconcile these things. She walked. Her clothing protected her from the elements. She could garb was adapted to almost every climate, regulating body temperature in heat and in cold. Still, she felt it when the air shifted, when the cold became too biting. Quickly she loped toward a rocky outcropping that would shield them from the wind, judging it appropriate to her purposes. Carefully, more carefully than if she were handling her grandmother, Pia set Zelda down upon the ground. She dug out the warm doublet that Zelda had been wearing when she came to Kakariko and put it on the princess in place of the stealth suit's chest piece. After putting away the armor, she checked the princess's coloring, pulse, breathing, and temperature. All normal. She breathed a sigh of relief. Zelda was fine. Except that she wouldn't wake up. Don't panic, she told herself, and this time they were not her grandmother's words. Do what you can. Or what you know to do, at least. Thus spurred, she retrieved Zelda's bedroll, laid it out, transferred her onto it, and covered her in blankets. They were shielded from the wind and any snowfall by the outcropping, so that would have to be enough for now. Going through their supplies, she found a very great deal of hot peppers that would serve them both, she thought, but especially the princess. She would make a few batches of pepper and cup stir-fry. It would be enough to last them for a while. She had piled the wood and struck fire from flint, breathing life into infant flames, when Zelda began to convulse. Fire forgotten, she went to the princess's side, thinking she had awoken. When she realized what was happening, her mind went white, and she ripped the blankets away from Zelda, clearing the space around her, loosening the doublets tie around her throat so she wouldn't choke herself. Then the convulsion shifted over into something else, and Zelda began to scream. The mouse roared, and she called the power from within herself. The invader was no longer a seed, it was a thing, a blight that slammed against the edge of her awareness. And as the blight pushed against her, she pushed back, cold and light and flaming darkness forming a barrier between them that made the world shudder. Be gone from here, she called out, and the blight answered with a sound that was equal parts hate and fear. You will not stop me. I will not be stopped, not any longer. The power inside of her was a well, and that well was deep, extending down into the firmament, down into geological ages that could only be guessed at. She reached deeper and deeper into herself, and the light poured out from it and into her, shattering the malice that clung to her, cleansing her body, infusing her mind. The power was there. The blight was not the calamity, whatever its power. It was not a match for her. It never had been, no matter how close it had come to killing her. This knowledge was a surety. She took hold of the golden light in her hands, and it was like holding the sun, holding the very beating heart of creation, and she drew deeper and deeper of the well until she could feel the goddess there with her, until she was the radiance at the heart of everything, and she could see the blight as a mote upon the surface of her being. With that strength, that burning power, she lashed out. The blight did not even scream. It writhed, once, and then it shattered like a thing made of clouded crystal, its shards spinning and twinkling and then evaporating into nothing, leaving behind a cool silence and clarity. She let go of the power, and it was outside of herself again, and she was in the presence of the goddess. My child, Hailey said, and her voice was sorrowful but warm, even proud, and the merest hint of that pride made Zelda's heart swell in her chest. You have come through a terrible trial. There are more to come, Zelda said, not to show her knowledge but because it was true. This is far from the worst of it. The goddess nodded. It is the least of it, though the danger was no less real than in any other moment. When you recovered that memory, recalled yourself as you had been when you first felt your power stirring within you, it returned to you. In response to danger to yourself and to the woman you travel with, you used it. You could do nothing else, or you would have both died. She folded her hands in front of her. But that you had no choice mattered little. The using of that power created echoes across Hyrule, echoes that reached across the entire land, and were heard by the calamity. It struck out at me, Zelda said, just as it must have done 100 years ago. But why? I thought the calamity was during battle with a hero. With Link. Does this mean it is now free? The calamity is still locked in combat, the goddess said, and now her gaze was averted, looking into nothing, and the twin suns of her eyes were soft and regretful. That has not changed in a century, though it will not last for much longer. No. The calamity left itself open in hopes of killing you. Then the eyes of the goddess were on her again, and the weight of that consideration was great. Do you know why? On the one hand, the question was absurd. Ganon was not a person, if it had ever truly been one, and did not think in the same way that persons did. Whether more complex than her own thoughts or less, she could not guess at the machinations of its mind any more than she could of storms, or fires, or gods. But still, she said to herself, the answer seems obvious. She faced her goddess, trying to seem as great as the task that had been laid upon her, to seem worthy of it. It fears the power I carry. It fears one of them, the goddess said, and smiled wanly at the shock that rocked Zelda. Yes, daughter. You're the carrier of two powers, and therein lies the true danger that threatens everything. She reached out with her hand, and though it was vaster than worlds, it was the size of a woman's hand as it tapped two fingers against the bone of Zelda's chest. The first of these powers is mine, carried on the conduit of your blood since before the founding of Hyrule. It is the strength that Ganon hates more than any other single thing and fears to the exclusion of all else. The hero and his sword are weapons by which the calamity has been laid low an uncountable number of times. But in every lifetime, every iteration of this cycle, it is my power, carried by your family, that he most fervently seeks to extinguish. It is the key to defeating him, and has always been. And that was why it had tried to kill her. And the other power? Now Hylia drew close to her, and Zelda's sense of perspective was rendered useless. Was the goddess the size of a person, or had Zelda herself grown to fill the cosmos? Were they separate at all? That is the last secret, the one thing above which all others he covets. You cannot feel it within yourself yet, but as memory returns to you, you will. It is the very engine of creation, the power of the old gods who made the world, the power by which the world might be remade in whatever shape a heart desires. Nothing is beyond it, no wish too mighty. She thought, instantly, of wishing the calamity away. In answer to that thought, Hylia's arms enshrouded her and drew her against the goddess, and light and safety and warmth infused her. It should have been something to make her feel at peace, but it did not. She knew it was there to cushion the blow of what was to come next. There is the real danger, the goddess said, and her voice was coming from within Zelda now. Ganon seeks that power, and he is clever beyond imagining. His cunning hound over conflicts too numerous to count. That power cannot be wielded against him until his defeat is assured, until all power and form is stripped away from him, because if it is wielded too early then Ganon may steal it, and everything will be lost. That was the danger of the blight that was sent against you. It was not here to kill you, but to seek out and steal the strength you wield. If it found only my power, well enough, and the world would be lost. If it found the other. She did not finish the thought. She did not have to. I am afraid, Zelda said, and it was true. We are both afraid, the goddess said, and the more she spoke the less Zelda was able to distinguish that voice from her own. Do not use that power until the very last moment, when victory is already in hand. I invest myself in you, as I have invested myself in each of your ancestors, in your mother and her mother and back through every age. As you regain your own memory, you will regain my perspective. Until then, know that your heart is my heart, your fears are my fears, your loves are my loves. Will I speak to you again? She did not know why she felt she was losing out so terribly, but she did. No, the goddess said, and her tears were an ocean that flowed through Zelda's eyes. I can offer you no more guidance, my daughter. But I will be with you, for each step of your journey. We are all with you, myself and every woman in your line that I have guided, and we will do everything we can to help you. I am afraid, Zelda said, of failing again. There, it was up, and it was true, and that fear was greater than her memory, greater than its loss, greater than her awareness. The world rested on her back and it was heavy, so terribly heavy. You will not fail, she said in answer to herself, with the goddess's voice. It was not a promise, nor a command, nor even a statement of fact, it was an oath. You are the light of Hyrule, shine on it, and save us all. The world fell away, calm and warmth and light replaced with dark, and cold, and pain. Her entire body was tense like a single muscle, the pain brilliant, almost blinding, as every part of her from the soles of her feet to the tendons in her neck had been contracted for so long that she had begun to cramp. For one terrible moment she thought the pressure of it would snap her bones. Then something gave, and her body dropped to the ground with a thud. She realized, distantly, that she had been arching her back, and probably on the verge of really hurting herself, as she breathed out a ragged sob. Even that her throat was raw. It felt like she had been screaming for days. "Oh," she said, because it seemed appropriate. It was just for herself. She did not think about who might have heard it. "He princess." Kaie's voice was above her, and had a very odd quality to it. She was hovering in that particular space where she knew she needed actual physical rest, but also hurt too much to stay still. She opened her eyes, looked up at Paia, blinked away the starkness of the light. "Paia," she said, and her throat did hurt, her voice a croak. "You've been crying." This was half true. Paia had been crying a lot. Her face was blotchy and red around her eyes and cheeks and nose, and most of her face was still covered in a thin sheen of tears and perspiration. And, based on her expression now that Zelda could make it out, she was still crying. There was one moment where Zelda thought Paia might make a scene. She did not. Instead, she turned away, scrubbed at her face with a handkerchief, and then turned back to Zelda with a perfectly neutral expression. Her face was still blotchy, but she'd made a valiant effort. "You've been unconscious for some time," Paia said, her sinuses audibly clogged but her tone level and controlled. "Near the end you began to convulse and scream. I wasn't sure what to do." There was a fire built, and Zelda could smell food cooking on it. Paia managed to be very productive when she wasn't sure what to do, apparently. "Where are we?" she said, looking around. She sat up, felt no obvious pains. Paia reached to her, was about to tell her not to move, but she put up one hand. "I am drained, Paia, but I am not injured. I promise. Please, where are we?" "We are at the foot of Lanayru Mountain." It was not clear if she felt rebuffed, but as she talked, Paia moved back to the pack where they stored their fruit and began to unpack some to prepare a second dish. In a bowl she began to prepare rice, herbs, and hardy mushrooms that she cut into thick slices. After we were struck by whatever that was, back there, you were unconscious, and I knew it. Rather, I thought I needed to get you away from there. After the bleeding earth, I knew that we could not take the road back until you were recovered. So I headed in the opposite direction. Bleeding earth was a phrase Zelda noted in her mind. That must have been the phenomenon that took place before the Calamity's attack. Revival of the monsters they had slain was involved, though she couldn't say why she knew that. "You carried me all the way here?" Paia nodded, not meeting her eyes. "I would have gone further, but this stone seemed like a good place to spend the night, if we needed to do so." Zelda shifted her position on the ground so that she could look out toward the snowfield, and the storm of malice and lightning sent a chill through her, deeper than the cold of the air could reach. The blight had not existed in a physical space, but if it had then its power would have looked like that, aimless destruction eating at the space around it, death without purpose. "You saved my life. Thank you." "Please don't thank me. After I couldn't stop that. After I failed to protect you, this was the bare minimum that duty demanded." Zelda did not know how to respond to that, and so she didn't. She just watched as Paia finished prepping the food, tested the batch she was currently cooking, apparently found it satisfactory. Zelda had been aware of the Lionel, if only briefly, and tried to imagine what would have happened if Paia had fought it. Paia was strong, far stronger than she had assumed a person could be through training alone, but that beast had been a relic of a bygone age, a threat that the Guardians had been built to defend against. She tried to imagine how her companion would have done against the thing, found she could not, would not allow herself to visualize the details. She closed her eyes against the thought, and as she did Paia said, "Your Grace, may I ask you a question?" 2 layers too deep. She had been able to deal with this for a while, but she was too tired to try now. "Paia, if we are going to travel together, I can. Have you addressing me this way?" She watched Paia's face instead of hurt. The other woman was confused. "Good enough. I'm grateful to you, more than I can express. But whatever I was before, I'm not that person now. I know how you think of me." And Paia flinched here, and Zelda thought that meant she had hit home. "But I do not recall that person, and you are the one I'm traveling with. You're not a servant to me. You're a confidant. A friend, I hope." But if we're going to travel together, if we're going to share in the work together and protect each other and teach each other, please. My name might be Zelda, but with you, even if it's only when we're alone, I am not a princess. Not to you. Pi did not respond immediately. She adjusted the fabric of her sleeves, retying knots as she thought. Then, after a long time, in a voice barely loud enough to be heard, regardless of how we treat each other, or what relationship you or I might wish to have, that does not change who you are. It does not change our stations. It did not hurt as much as she thought it would when she moved. She crawled the few short feet over to Pio, drew her legs up under her to be seated in a position not unlike her companion's, and took one of Pio's hands in both of hers. Pia blushed furiously, like a switch being flipped, and Zelda was sorry to embarrass her, but she needed to make this point. She leaned in. What do you want to call me? No, do not answer right away. Think on it, and seriously, I am not asking you what duty tells you that you should call me. I'm asking what you want to call me, in your heart of hearts, and what you would call me if you wanted there to be no barriers between us. She did not know why she thought this was so important, but she did. In trying to explore this, she found a need to articulate it. We have traveled together, eaten together, fought together, and protected each other. You held my life in your hands and carried me to safety. I would fight for you too, Pia. You cannot be a servant to me. Knowing that I want us to be equals with each other. What do you wish to call me? Pia looked at her, then really looked at her, and her regard was so frank and open that Zelda did not know how to interpret it. Felt Pia's hand like a frightened bird that might try to take wing. She did not look away, though she had asked for this vulnerability and would not shy from it. Finally, after a very long time, with a voice that teetered on the edge of pain, I would call you Zelda. She allowed herself a smile. Then do. Please. I never seek permission for a question. The two of them prepped their own bowls of hot pepper stir-fry and sat on opposite sides of the fire for warmth. Pia had spent the time thinking, quite, and Zelda did not want to push her more than she'd already been pushed. Discomfort could lead to resentment, if she wasn't mindful. Zelda was still blowing on her own meal, trying to cool it, when Pia finally said, What happened back there? Which part? All of it, I suppose. From when you stood at the gate. Your eyes turned golden and then everything got very hard to understand. Well, she took a bite of stir-fry, found it delectable, chewed as she thought, swallowed. I suppose I might as well start at, oh, this is so spicy, I should tell you about the memory. She did. She described it in every detail, the walk down from the mountain and the conversation with the champions and Mipha's words that had unlocked her power, how she remembered these people and had the sense that they were important, but could not recall anything of them outside of that memory. Pia had been present when she had described her dreams of Hylia to Impa, so she transitioned smoothly into the things she had learned about both of her sources of power and the reaction that the calamity had to each. She described the blight, about its attack on her and its attempt to wrest her life and power away, and how with the goddess's strength she had shattered it. She talked about how the goddess would not be speaking to her again. Before she realized she was doing it, she talked about being afraid. By the time she was done, the stir-fry was gone and the mushroom congee was ready. Zelda filled both their bowls, no longer hungry, but knowing she needed the food. The stir-fry had helped warm her, and from the first bite of the congee she could feel strength returning to her. Pia had a very good sense of what food would best serve a given need. What do you want to do now? Zelda looked up at Pia's question, but did not immediately answer as she was chewing. Shall we return to Kakariko village? Grandmother did say that we should see her again once you had recovered one of your memories. I do not know if we can reach the road without crossing the storm, though I'm sure we could teleport. Ma'am. She swallowed. I want to go up the mountain. It took a visible effort for Pia to say, Why? This place is important. That was not the half of it, and both knew that now, whatever was at the top of Mount Laniru was the site of her last failure to unlock her power, but it was supposed to have been a triumph. I know it's not in the album, but I still wish to see it. It's a holy place, I think. Pia nodded in the affirmative. Hylia said I would not speak with her again. If that place is related to her power, then I think it could still help us. Or at least, it won't hurt to see. Pia nodded. I think that's a good idea. A pause. Zelda. They ate the rest of their meal in silence. The mountain was clad in a preternatural darkness, the snow falling on it from clouds so thick they obscured the sun even during the day. The effect was fascinating to Zelda, but not so fascinating that she could devote any energy to it. The going was long, and hard, and cold, so cold that it was not even met. She was thankful for the meals they had eaten before, for the tattered doublet she was wearing. Hi's ability to walk through this cold wearing the same clothes she might wear in the relative warmth of the lowlands was mystifying, lending her a sense of superhuman resilience. As they ascended, Pia taught her how to spot the ice lizalfos who waited in the snow, how to watch for the great roaming eyes that followed them like spots of fire. They did not stop to fight, both were tired and wanted badly to reach the summit. Instead they walked around the beasts, their tread so practiced and light that they could not be heard over the wind, and where that was impossible Zelda tossed a bomb toward the monsters. Usually, they did not react to it before she detonated the device and sent Elizalfos flying off the side of the mountain. Time was soft on the mountain, a fuzzy thing that was made obscured just as the sun was, and neither of them knew for how long they worked, though it could not have been more than a few hours. Up and around they went, up and around, and as they ascended Zelda had the sense that they were walking into the past, as if the height of the world, its crown, stood at the very beginning of all time. Years melted away as they walked, and on some level she wondered if she would meet herself coming down 100 years prior, if each of them would have some warning for the other. Why am I thinking these things? Is that the influence of Hylia, unlocked through my memory? It was not a thought she found calming. She felt emerald, adrift, no longer sure of where or when she was. Only looking at Pia reminded her, allowed her to put one foot in front of the other with confidence. When they reached a height at which enormous crystals, whether genuine crystal or ice formations Zelda could not tell, began to jut out the side of the mountain, Pia said back to her, "I think we're almost there." They spoke quietly. Even though the wind threatened to deafen them, it seemed wrong to raise one's voice on the mountain, though neither would have said so if they hadn't been climbing it. The path grew more level, the walking easier, and when Zelda looked to the sky the cloud cover was gone. The sun had gone down and the stars were out. It was a beautiful sight. Somehow the stars looked different here than anywhere else she'd been, even compared to the peak of Mount Hylia on the Great Plateau. She felt like she was looking into the past again, but did not feel immersed. Her feet were planted, and she was sure of herself, and looking up at the stars brought her a sense of peace. The past remained and would guide them, if they knew to follow. Then the present asserted itself. In her reverie, Zelda had fallen behind. Pia was some distance ahead of her, was the first to round the corner to the shrine. What she did, she gasped aloud, covered her mouth with her hands, and staggered backward before falling into a sitting position, still pushing herself away with her feet. She made a high-pitched, distressed sound, like a child seeing something new and terrible. "It is not physical danger," Zelda told herself, though now she was sprinting to catch up. "If it was a physical danger, Pia would call out to me, would be in a defensive position. It's not a physical danger. She rounded the corner and turned to the shrine, and all thought, all perspective, all meaning was blasted from her mind, snow swept away by wind. The dragon was beautiful. No other word so perfectly matched her immediate impression of it. Its serpentine body was hundreds of feet long, coiled upon and around the mountain's peak, sinuously weaving back and forth like an enormous river made of scales that shone like polished mirrors. Its head was the size of a small house, the scales of its face sweeping back and transitioning into a crystalline crest that gave the impression of carefully cultivated matrices of ice. Its sides did not move as it breathed, but great plumes of condensation issued from its nostrils, geysers of glittering ice crystals that spun through the air, dancing and catching light like stars. It groaned, and the sound was deep and enormous, born of a diaphragm that would shake the firmament with its strength. But it had no strength. In truth, it had no beauty, either, for its beauty was marred beyond recognition by the corruption that had spread over it. She had never seen the malice in person, but she knew it by sight, the congealed form of hatred that stuck to the dragon's skin like pulsating, breathing tumors. 4, or 5, or 6, or more, pools stood in the dragon's body, reaching down into its scales, into its flesh with tendrils the color of shadow and sickness, turning its natural coloring to something else. Out of each of these masses rose stalks, almost like mushrooms, except that instead of caps they were crowned by great golden eyes that glowed with an unnamed power, staring out into the world to lend perspective to a force that would see it all ruined. One of those masses grew out of the dragon's head, and there was the greatest of all the eyes, an eye so large that it nearly eclipsed the head itself, and as that eye blinked the dragon groaned again, low and plaintive and with the same tones as before. Its hands reached out for nothing, its talons dull and yielding and dark and without aim. This is profanity. Her sense of the sacred had been sharpened by her meetings with Hylia, but before this moment she had not known what the word profane meant. Even the blight attacking her within her own thoughts was not like this, at least that had only been a crime against herself. To do something like this, to such a spirit, She walked forward before she realized she was doing it, stepped past Paya. Paya's hand flashed and grabbed hold of hers. When their eyes met, Paya shook her head furiously, never taking her other hand away from her mouth as if she was afraid that she would scream. She could not speak the words, but the plea was plain in her eyes. Do not go over there. Whatever happened to the dragon can happen to you. The malice wants you and it is here. I have to help it, Paya, she said, and pulled her hand free. That she was strong enough to do so surprised her, surprised them both. I will be careful, I promise. I will also do what is required of me. Tears welled up in Paya's eyes, and she shook her head again, and Zelda walked to the dragon. Flashes of green and brown danced in front of her as she walked toward it, and she willed herself calm, forced herself to take in the rest of the scene. The dragon was at rest on the face of the mountain above the Spring of Wisdom, which was built around a statue of Hylia. Its head rested next to the statue, its roomy eyes rolling between the sky and the statue's face as it let out another low, plaintive sound. Below the dragon's pain, below the wind, below the sound of the malice bubbling as it ate away at the air and fed knowledge to an evil power far away, she heard the jingling of many bells. Flashes of green and brown in the spring, along the length of the dragon between the masses of corruption. Something was there, but she did not know what, could not see. It was just on the edge of her perception. I have to see, she told herself. I have to know what this is. I have to know everything that I can. I must. She turned her eyes inward, into that space within her thoughts where the goddess had embraced her. There was a light there, a single point. If she found it, then it would grow into a flame, great and terrible and an affront to the calamity. She did not need that, not yet. She took only part of it, the barest sliver, lifted it up out of the space inside of her, willed it behind her eyes. She could feel it filling her thoughts, filling her awareness, infusing her with a deep and fundamental knowing. She opened her eyes. Stopped again, in their tracks. Little creatures, forest spirits, she immediately thought, were all over the spring, on the stone and the water and the dragon itself between the patches of malice. They were a little shorter than waist high, their bodies having the appearance of knots of wood with protrusions shaped like arms and legs. On the front of their bodies were affixed leaves of green and red and brown, with holes cut into them to give the impression of eyes and mouths. The leaves, nearly as large as their bodies for many of the spirits, lent them a sense of childlike enthusiasm. Despite the horror that they were dancing around, despite her own fears, she could not help finding them very cute. They were singing. How had she not heard their singing before? They sang in children's voices as they danced, waving flowers and leaves around in their hands, and the tune they sang was wandering and sprightly and fast and harmonious, calling to mind boughs swaying in the wind. When they sang there was light the color of grass and healthy summer leaves, and this light enveloped the malice, making the great eyes blink against the radiance. One of them was dancing and singing in front of the statue of the goddess, whirling about with abandon, its legs so stubby that it had to rotate its entire body to take steps. This one she approached. It did not notice her, too absorbed in a song. She stood watching it for what felt like a very long time. The dragon sighed again. Excuse me, she said, and the spirit stopped instantly, whirling on her and staring up at her with a leaf face that looked sad and happy at the same time, like a child's drawing. What are you doing? You can see me? She was about to answer when it began to hop back and forth between its little leg stubs. You can see me? It turned back to the dragon, back to the crowd of its fellows, and shouted, Hey, everybody! Somebody can see us! The dancing and the singing stopped and the light winked out as all the dozens of forest spirits turned to look at her with eyes that went eyes. There was a long moment of regard between them where she felt the pressure of their attention and wondered if she had made a terrible mistake, and then they all descended from their places, whooping and shouting and laughing, and they all had the voices of children at play, and they were all talking at once.
You can see us. Nobody's been able to see us in 100 years. Mr. Hero was the last person who could see us. Do you know Mr. Hero? I bet you know Mr. Hero. You must be friends with Mr. Hero. Wait, you're the one Mr. Hero was with. You're Miss Princess. Miss Princess. Miss Princess.
They were a mob gathered in front of her, a tiny sea of faces and voices shouting all at once, delirious in their jubilation, and the force of their laughter and happiness could have swept her away, made her forget why she was here, but looking past them, she saw the dragon, and wrested back control of herself.
Please,
she said, and repeated it until a hush fell over them.
What's happening here?
The spirits all looked at each other, and some silent communion took place before the first that she had spoken to turned back to her, apparently the designated liaison.
Nadra is sick. Nadra is the dragon?
She was not sure that
sick
was the word she would have used.
Nadra is the guardian spirit of the mountain, and the spring, and all the land nearby.
The crowd nodded together with the sound of bells and rustling leaves.
They've been here for a very long time. They've protected everything and everyone for a very, very, very long time. But then they got sick.
It was holding the stem of a plant she didn't recognize. With that stem it gestured at the malice.
We've been trying to help Nadra get better, because Korok magic is very strong. We can heal the sickness when it's in the ground or the water or the woods, but something's different. I think Nadra's power is making the sickness stronger. That makes sense.
Images of the blight returned to her, that creeping corruption that sought to use up her power for itself.
If it's drawing on the vitality of its victim, then it would be much more difficult to dislodge, provided that the spirit is sufficiently powerful. The greater the power corrupted, the more impossible it becomes for the victim to free itself. Yeah, that's what Nadra had been saying. Nadra can speak?
She found the idea difficult to parse. What sounds could a mouth like that make?
Yeah. Of course. Well, maybe not in a way that you can understand, but they can talk to us. When we first came to help them, Nadra tried to tell us what was happening. But even though we were trying to help them, they kept getting sicker and sicker, and then they stopped trying to talk at all. Maybe if more of us were here, brought.
The whole crowd looked up at Nadra, and she could feel their frustration and their sadness crackling in the air above them.
Then the earth shook really bad a little while ago, and they got their voice back, but they just keep saying the same thing over and over again.
The dragon groaned, low and loud, once more the same sound as before, and Zelda felt that she could hear the word, or very nearly. The knowledge was on the other side of her understanding. If she had all of her memories back, would she know this language?
What are they saying? They're trying to call Hylia.
The world crystallized around her as she recalled the sound of her own power, how it had echoed far enough for the calamity to hear. Wouldn't the spirit have heard too, so much nearer? Wouldn't it have known that its protector, the protector of all things who had charged it with guarding this place, was nearby? And now it's calling her. Calling me. She looked to the dragon, and then to the west, seeing in her mind's eye the castle that stood far away. She looked back to Paya, who did not know what was happening, could neither see nor hear the Koroks. The snowfield was a blasted ruin. Paya had carried her out of it. Could she subject her to that horror again? Nadra called out, in pain and delirium, as she did not understand the language, but she heard her own name in its voice. She wiped at her face, looked down as a tiny wooden nub pressed gently against her other hand.
Don't cry, Miss Princess,
the Korok said, and it was trying so hard to make her feel better, its voice so earnest and tender that it twisted the inside of her chest into knots.
We know it looks bad, but Korok magic is strong. We haven't healed Nadra yet, but we'll try really, really hard, okay? Even if it takes a long time, we'll work hard and we'll make them better. So don't cry, okay?
The crowd pressed in around her, patting gently at her legs, promising from every direction that they would make it okay, that everything would be all right. Nadra called out to her again. She lifted her face, set her jaw, sniffed, swallowed.
You should all go. And Miss Princess? All of you go. Go somewhere safe. I will tend to Nadra.
A wave of shock passed over them, and for one moment the Korks were utterly still.
You can heal them? Yes,
she said, and nodded. She needed to exude confidence to match their kindness. She needed strength to match the task in front of her.
Yes, I can heal them. I will heal them. But after I do, the thing that made Nader sick is going to be very angry, so you had better run.
There was another moment where the Korok shared their silent communion. Then they cheered, and as a body held aloft their flowers, their stems, their little leaves, and began to float into the air. Their laughter was like rain falling on the mountainside. The spokesperson waved its free hand happily at her, as if it needed to catch her attention again after she had looked away for about a second.
Miss Princess.
She nodded to it.
We're going to go back to the Lost Woods. It's, that way.
It pointed in the general direction of the northwest.
Next to the big fiery mountain. You should come visit us. Okay. Look for the big tree. Promise you'll come visit us. Okay. I promise,
she said, both for the Koroks and because she wanted to see where these happy spirits made their homes so deeply that it bordered on a physical need. They cheered as a body, waved to her as they ascended, shouted,
"Bye, Miss Princess. Come visit us soon. Bye. Bye, bye, bye."
They rose like birds on the wing and swept away as a laughing cloud at even greater speed. In moments they were gone, distant, deaf. The wind howled, and Nader called out to her.
"Paya."
She called over the wind, turned back to her companion. Paya had gotten to her feet, which was good.
I'm going to fix this. I need you to be ready to run, to use the paraglider if we have to.
I should get a second one of those made.
Will you be ready?
In her secret heart she did not have enough faith in Paya, but Paya had faith in her, enough to nod. They began to stretch, to wait with expectant eyes and absolute surety in the rightness of what Zelda was doing. That faith in Zelda's righteousness weighed against a death too terrible to comprehend with the senses of the body, was like a physical force. Zelda felt it pushing at her back as she turned her attention back to Nader. The malice hissed as the dragon breathed, and she felt calm, calmer than she'd been in a long time. She reached down within herself, and the golden power was there. She did not take a sliver. This time, the whole thing was in her hands. She breathed life into it until it was a furnace, until the sound filled the physical air and light shone from her like the sun. She opened her eyes and saw the aura of her power all around her, saw that Nader's head had lifted, that the dragon's eyes were focused on her, in hope and pain and fear and love. The power built, and built, and built, built until it was barely contained in her skin, until the wind was still and only the ringing of her strength could be heard. I wonder if you can see this, she thought at the calamity at the heart of the kingdom. Then she let go, and the power roared free of her, and the world was filled with light. The calamity staggered with a bellow, and the hero was upon it with flashing steel, and its fury and its pain were incalculable. It did see, it also felt, and that feeling was far more terrible. The light obliterated the malice, evaporating it like water, dissolving even the smoke that it left behind. The eyes all turned to look at her with expressions of cold, blank hatred, and then were gone, swept into nothing. Its influence on Nader's body disappeared in an instant, a shattering of her carapace of darkness, and the color of ice and rain radiated out from inside of them. Nader roared, and she did not know the language, but she knew that it was a sound of relief, of power restored, of warning, of exultation. The dragon's body rose from the mountainside all at once, taking to the air as if it were moving through water. They circled around the mountain once, bellowing, as Zelda looked up in wonder. She remembered herself, then, and ran toward Paya. The two of them prepared to try to outrun death as the beast in the castle unleashed its hatred at them and a burning comet streaked from the heart of the land. They had no real plan, save to run. When a shadow fell over them as they ran, they both looked up. The sight struck still both of them. Talons the size of horses closed gently around them, lifting them up into the air. The touch was warm, even though the air around them was freezing, even though they should have been frozen themselves. Zelda looked to Paya and she was laughing, now far past her fears, and Zelda laughed too as the dragon carried them away from the mountain. They swept down into the snowfield, and in their passing the storm abated, ripped apart by purifying cold, and the air was still and quiet. Nader carried them above the road named for the mountain, and the beasts on that road scrambled and hid from their passage. The wind was whipped into a frenzy, but the world was calm. The dragon was calm. The calamity's fury struck the mountain on the side opposite the shrine, and the mountain shook. Nature bellowed, a high and musical sound, and Zelda knew that it called her name. End of chapter.